I don't remember the exact day I retired. People always expect you to remember that. The date, the feeling, the celebration. But for me, it didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, the way most things do when you're already past noticing changes. One week I was still waking up early for work, and the next there was nowhere I needed to be. By the winter of 1993, I'd been retired for almost a year. I was 68 then. Not old, not young. Old enough that people spoke a little louder when they talked to me, but young enough that I still felt embarrassed when they did. I lived alone in a small house at the edge of town. It wasn't remote exactly, just far enough that you didn't hear much traffic, and close enough that you still got mail every day. The house had 3 rooms I actually used: the kitchen, the living room, and the bedroom. The rest stayed closed most of the time. When my wife was alive, we used every corner. After she passed, the house slowly decided which spaces still mattered. I didn't feel lonely in the way people imagine loneliness. There was no constant sadness, no crying at night. It was more like a background hum, something you stop noticing because it never changes. Silence becomes a kind of furniture. You move around it. You don't question it. My days followed a pattern. I woke up early, even though I didn't need to. Old habits don't ask permission before they stay. I'd make coffee the same way every morning, using the same mug with a small crack near the handle. I'd sit at the kitchen table and watch the light change through the window, not because there was anything to see, just because it was there. After breakfast, I'd read the paper, sometimes cover to cover, sometimes only the front page and the obituaries. You start recognizing names after a while. That's when you know you've been somewhere too long. Winters back then were heavier than they are now. Or maybe that's just how memory works. The snow felt thicker, the cold stayed longer. By December, the world outside my door slowed down. Fewer cars, fewer voices. Even the dogs in the neighborhood barked less. That door became important. It was an old wooden door, painted white at some point long before I owned the house. The paint had started to peel near the bottom, where moisture always found a way in. Every morning I checked it before I did anything else. Not out of fear, just routine. Make sure it was locked, make sure the latch still caught, make sure the wind hadn't pushed anything loose overnight. When you live alone long enough, routines stop being choices. They become anchors. Most afternoons, I sat in the same chair by the window. I didn't always read. Sometimes I just watched the yard, snow piling up along the fence, birds landing and leaving without ceremony. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth telling someone else about. My health was fine, or at least fine enough that I didn't complain. I got tired more easily than I used to, but that's what age does. I took my pills when I remembered. I skipped them when I didn't. I hadn't been to a doctor in a while, but I wasn't avoiding anything. I just didn't feel the need. That winter I remember thinking that everything had settled. My life wasn't exciting, but it was steady, predictable, and predictable felt safe. There was nothing in my days that stood out. No events, no surprises, no reason to believe anything was about to change. And that's why I didn't think much of it when I first noticed movement near the door. At first I assumed it was the wind, or a shadow, or one of the neighborhood dogs passing through the yard the way they sometimes did. Animals came and went. They always had. I didn't open the door. I didn't call out. I just noticed, and then I went back to my chair. That's how most things begin, quietly. I don't know how long he had been there before I finally opened the door, and that's the truth. Not a dramatic way of saying it, just the honest gap in my memory. It might have been a day, or it might have been 2. Time had a way of flattening out back then, especially in winter, when every hour looked the same and every sound felt distant. I remember noticing him again that afternoon, when I went to check the latch, the same way I always did, and this time there was no mistaking it. He was sitting just off to the side of the porch, far enough back that he wasn't blocking the steps, close enough that he was clearly waiting for something. He wasn't small, but he wasn't large either. The kind of dog you don't assign a breed to because there's nothing remarkable about him. Brown coat, a little grey around the muzzle, ears that didn't quite match each other. He looked older than a stray should look, and calmer than one usually is. He didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail. He just watched me, eyes steady, posture still, like he had already decided how this was going to go and was simply allowing me time to catch up. I stood there longer than I meant to, hand still on the doorknob, waiting for him to move or make some kind of request, but he didn't. Eventually I closed the door again, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't see a reason to do anything else. I told myself he belonged to someone nearby. I told myself he'd leave once he realized there was nothing for him here. That night, when I went to bed, I noticed the quiet was different. Not louder, not softer, just altered, like a room after furniture has been rearranged. In the morning, when I opened the door again, he was still there, curled closer now, tucked in near the wall where the wind couldn't reach him as easily. I sighed, not in frustration, but in resignation, the way you do when something small refuses to resolve itself. I set out a bowl of water without thinking too much about it. That was the first mistake, though I wouldn't understand why until much later. He drank slowly, deliberately, as if he wasn't worried the water would disappear. I didn't pet him. I didn't speak to him. I didn't invite him inside. I just went back to my chair and told myself that this was temporary, that winter made animals act strangely, that people abandoned things when it got cold. Over the next few days, the pattern settled in without discussion. He stayed. I didn't name him. Naming something makes it permanent, and I wasn't ready for that. He slept near the door. He followed me with his eyes when I crossed the room. He never tried to come inside, even when the door was open longer than usual. That should have struck me as odd, but it didn't. I was used to quiet agreements. My life had been built on them. I fed him scraps at first, then proper food when I realized he wasn't leaving. He accepted everything with the same calm attention, never rushing, never looking over his shoulder. Some nights, when the wind pressed hard against the house and the boards creaked the way old houses do, I'd hear him shift outside, repositioning himself closer to the door, like that was where he belonged. It didn't feel like I had taken in a dog. It felt like he had chosen a place to stop, and that place happened to be my doorstep. I didn't question it. I didn't ask where he came from. I didn't wonder how long he intended to stay. I had lived long enough to know that not everything arrives with an explanation, and not everything needs one. At the time, he was just there. Another quiet presence in a life that had already learned how to make room for silence. Once he stayed, the days began to arrange themselves around him without either of us acknowledging that it was happening. There was no moment where I decided he was mine, and there was no moment where he acted like he belonged to me. It was subtler than that, quieter. He simply became part of the pattern, the way frost on the windows or the creak in the hallway floor had become part of it. Every morning, when I opened the door to check the latch and let the cold air in for a second too long, he was there, sometimes sitting, sometimes lying down with his head resting on his paws, always in roughly the same place, just far enough back that I didn't have to step around him, just close enough that I couldn't pretend not to see him. He never rushed me. He never followed me when I stepped outside to take the trash out or check the mailbox. He waited. That was his defining quality, patience. I started keeping an extra bowl near the door, refilling it without ceremony, the way you refill a bird feeder once you accept that the birds are coming whether you pay attention or not. Snow came steadily that winter, slow and persistent, covering the yard in layers that didn't melt before the next one arrived. The world narrowed to what could be seen through the windows, and beyond that, to what could be felt through the walls. Inside, the house stayed quiet. Outside, he stayed near the door. Some afternoons, I caught myself glancing toward him before I realized I was doing it. checking his position the way you check a clock without meaning to. He didn't sleep deeply, not that I could tell. Even when his eyes were closed, his body seemed aware of movement, of sound, of me. When I stood up from my chair, he shifted. When I moved toward the kitchen, his head lifted slightly. It wasn't concern, it wasn't excitement, it was attention, steady and unbroken. Days passed like that, indistinguishable from one another. I read less. I watched the yard more. Sometimes I spoke out loud without realizing it, a comment about the weather or the mail, or nothing at all. And though he couldn't hear me through the door, it felt less strange knowing someone was there on the other side of it. Nights were the same. I locked the door, checked the windows, turned off the lights. Before going to bed, I looked through the small glass pane at the top of the door and saw his shape settled in for the night, angled so his back took the wind instead of the door. I remember thinking more than once that he chose the coldest spot on the porch and then worked around it, adjusting just enough to stay comfortable. That detail stuck with me because it felt deliberate. Winter stretched on. Weeks passed without anything worth marking. No visitors, no phone calls that lasted more than a minute, no interruptions. And through all of it he remained, unmoving in his role, unremarkable in every way except his consistency. Looking back now, I can see how much I began to rely on that quiet certainty, how the sight of him there reassured me in a way I didn't know I needed. At the time, though, it didn't feel important. It felt ordinary, and that, more than anything, is why I didn't notice when things began to shift. The first thing that changed wasn't him, it was me. And that's probably why I didn't take it seriously. When you've lived inside the same body for nearly 7 decades, you learn to excuse its small complaints. A little stiffness in the morning doesn't feel like a warning, it feels like age. A short breath climbing the steps doesn't feel urgent, it feels expected. That winter, I started waking up more tired than usual. The kind of tired that doesn't come from bad sleep, but from something heavier, something that settles in your chest and doesn't leave when the sun comes up. I told myself it was the cold. Cold makes everything work harder. Your heart, your lungs, your patience. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my coffee cooling faster than I could drink it, feeling a faint pressure behind my ribs, nothing sharp, nothing dramatic, just a quiet insistence that I ignored because it didn't have a name. The days stayed the same, but my movements slowed. I noticed it only when I dropped things, a spoon slipping from my hand, a letter falling to the floor because my fingers didn't close in time. I laughed at it once, muttering something about clumsiness, then bent down to pick it up and had to pause halfway there, one hand braced against the table until the room steadied itself again. Moments like that are easy to forget because they don't demand action. They pass, and you let them. He noticed. At least, that's how it seems now. At the time, I didn't connect anything. I just became aware that he was closer. Not inside, never that, but closer to the threshold than before. When I opened the door, he no longer sat back against the wall. He positioned himself nearer the center, as if measuring the space differently. When I stepped outside to fetch the mail, he rose immediately and stood beside me, not touching, just aligned. His eyes followed my hands more than my face, tracking small movements, the way they trembled slightly when I tried to unlock the mailbox or lift the paper bundle under my arm. Once when I leaned down to pick up a package, a wave of dizziness washed over me so quickly that I had to stop, one knee touching the ground before I realized what I was doing. He moved then, the first time I had ever seen him move quickly. Stepping between me and the edge of the porch, body firm, solid, blocking my forward motion. I remember feeling annoyed, not angry, just inconvenienced. I told him to move, my voice sharper than I intended, and he did, slowly, reluctantly. But he didn't go far. He stayed close enough that I had to step around him to get back inside. After that, he began positioning himself in ways I didn't understand, sitting directly in front of the door instead of to the side, standing when I stood, even if I was only crossing the room, shifting when I reached for my coat. He started whining sometimes, not loud, not desperate, just a low sound that barely carried through the door, like a question that hadn't been answered. I dismissed it the same way I dismissed everything else. Dogs react to weather. Dogs sense mood. Dogs pick up habits. That's what people say. I told myself he was reacting to the winter, to the long nights, to the isolation. I never considered that he might be reacting to me. There were evenings when I felt strangely cold, even with the heat on, my hands pale and stiff, my breath shallow. I'd sit longer in my chair because standing felt like more effort than it should have. Through the glass, I could see him watching, head tilted slightly, eyes fixed in that steady way that had begun to feel less comforting and more deliberate. Once, I remember thinking, and this is the part that stays with me, that it felt like he was waiting for something to happen, not hoping for it, not fearing it, just expecting it. I shook the thought away because it didn't make sense, and because admitting it would have meant admitting that the quiet warnings I'd been brushing aside were real. So I kept my routine. I checked the door, I filled the bowl, I sat in my chair. I told myself that age explains everything, and that animals don't understand bodies the way people do. I didn't know then how much I was wrong, or how close I already was to the moment when ignoring small things would no longer be an option. The night it happened didn't announce itself in any way that would have made sense afterward. There was no storm warning on the radio, no sudden drop in temperature that stood out from the rest of that winter, no feeling of dread that made me pause or reconsider my plans. It was just another evening, quiet and uneventful, the kind that blends so completely into the weeks around it that you only recognize it later because of what followed. I remember making a simple dinner and leaving half of it untouched. Not because I felt sick, but because I lost interest halfway through eating. The fork resting in my hand longer than it should have, my thoughts drifting without direction. The house felt heavier than usual, the air thick, as if it took more effort to breathe it in and push it back out again. I told myself it was the heat, that the old furnace always overdid it when the temperature dropped too far outside. I stood up from the table to adjust the thermostat, and that's when the first real wave hit me. Not pain exactly, but a sudden weakness that traveled upward from my legs, leaving them unsteady, unreliable. I gripped the counter until it passed, heart beating faster than I was comfortable with, then laughed quietly at myself for standing there like an old man who'd forgotten how to balance. Through the glass of the door, I could see him rise immediately, moving closer than he ever had before, his body positioned squarely in front of the entrance, head lifted, ears alert. When I reached for my coat, he let out a low bark, short, sharp, nothing like the quiet sounds he'd made before. It startled me enough that I stopped, hand still resting on the fabric, my breath shallow, my chest tight in a way I didn't want to name. I told him to settle down, my voice coming out thinner than usual, and when I stepped toward the door, he stepped with me, blocking my path again, his stance firm, unmoving. That's when the dizziness returned. Stronger this time, the room tilting just enough that the walls seemed farther away than they should have been. I remember thinking very clearly that I needed to sit down, but my body didn't wait for the thought to finish. My knees buckled without warning, and the last thing I felt before hitting the floor was the cold from the door seeping through my shirt as my shoulder struck it on the way down. I don't remember calling out. I don't remember the sound my body made when it hit the floor. What I remember is the dog barking, not once, not twice, but over and over again, loud enough that it cut through the fog in my head, sharp enough that it felt like it was happening inside my chest rather than outside the door. I tried to move, to push myself up, but my arms wouldn't respond. My fingers curling uselessly against the wood as my vision narrowed and the edges of the room dimmed. The barking didn't stop. It changed, grew more frantic, more insistent. And somewhere in that blur of sound and darkness, I became aware of voices that weren't his. A neighbor's shout, footsteps on the porch, the door opening, cold air rushing in. After that, everything fractured into pieces I couldn't hold on to. The ceiling spinning past my line of sight, someone saying my name like they were afraid it might disappear if they didn't repeat it, hands lifting me in a way that felt both gentle and urgent. The last clear image I have from that night is his silhouette in the doorway, standing exactly where he always did, watching as they carried me out, his barking finally giving way to silence once he knew I was no longer alone. When I woke up, the light was wrong. That was the first thing I noticed, not pain, not fear, just the color of the room. It was too bright and too even, the kind of light that doesn't come from a window. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was or how I had arrived there. My mouth felt dry, my tongue heavy, and my body felt distant, like it belonged to someone else, and I was only borrowing it. Then the sounds began to separate themselves. The steady beep of a monitor, the low murmur of voices down the hall, the faint squeak of shoes on linoleum. And I understood that I was in a hospital. A nurse noticed I was awake and spoke to me gently, as if volume might undo whatever fragile balance had brought me back. She told me not to move. She told me help was coming. She told me I was lucky. People say that word a lot in places like that, and I've learned it can mean many things. Lucky to be alive, lucky someone noticed, lucky it didn't happen later. I nodded because that's what you do when you don't yet have the strength to ask questions. A doctor came in not long after. He explained things carefully, without urgency, as though what had happened was already finished and no longer required emotion. My heart, he said, had struggled more than I realized. The cold, the exertion, the delay in seeking care, none of it was unusual on its own, but together they had pushed my body further than it was willing to go. Another hour, he told me, maybe 2, and the outcome might have been different. He didn't say worse. He didn't need to. I stayed there for several days. Time moved differently, measured in meal trays and medication cups instead of hours. My body felt weak, but clearer, like a fog had lifted and left behind an uncomfortable awareness of how close I had come to something I wasn't ready to name. People visited, neighbors, a distant relative, all of them kind, all of them telling the same story from slightly different angles. They said the dog wouldn't stop barking. They said he wouldn't move from the door. They said that at first they thought something was wrong with him, and then they realized something was wrong with me. No one needed to explain which dog they meant. When I was finally allowed to go home, the house felt smaller than I remembered. The chair by the window was still there. The mug with the cracked handle was still on the counter. Everything was unchanged, and yet it all felt provisional, like it was waiting to see what I would do next. Before I sat down, before I unpacked the bag the hospital had sent me home with, I went to the door. He was there, not lying down this time, sitting upright, alert, as if he'd been holding that position since the night I left. He didn't bark. He didn't move toward me. He just watched, eyes steady, posture calm, the way he always had. I opened the door slowly, expecting, I don't know what, some shift, some acknowledgement, some visible reaction to my return. There was none. He stood, stepped back once to give me room, and waited. That's when the weight of it settled in. Not the fear, not the relief, but the understanding. He hadn't panicked. He hadn't acted on instinct the way people like to imagine animals do. He had observed. He had adjusted. He had stayed. All the small things I had brushed aside, all the moments I had ignored, they lined up in my mind with a clarity that was impossible to dismiss now. I reached for the doorframe to steady myself, And for the first time since he arrived, he moved closer without hesitation, pressing his side lightly against my leg, solid and warm, as if to remind me that some warnings don't come in words, and some help arrives long before you realize you need it. Life didn't return to what it had been before. It didn't change dramatically either. It simply adjusted, the way a house settles after a long winter. The beams shifting just enough that you notice the difference if you've lived there long enough. I moved slower after that, not because I was afraid, but because I was paying attention in a way I hadn't before. I took my pills when I was supposed to. I sat down when my body asked me to. I stopped pretending that routine was the same thing as health. He stayed. There was no discussion about it, no decision. One morning, after I'd been home a while, I opened the door and stepped aside instead of blocking the way, and he came in as if he'd always known that moment would arrive. He didn't explore the house. He didn't sniff the corners or test the furniture. He walked to the same spot near the door and lay down, positioning himself the way he always had, just on the other side of the threshold now. It felt less like an arrival and more like a continuation. The days found a new rhythm. I still sat in the same chair. The coffee still cooled too quickly in the winter air. The door still mattered. The difference was that I noticed things, the way my breathing changed when I stood too fast, the way the room felt when I pushed myself too far, the way he lifted his head before I realized something was wrong. He never made a show of it. He never demanded attention. He simply watched, and I learned to trust that. Sometimes, in the evenings, I'd catch him sitting by the door, facing it the same way he had when he lived outside. Old habits linger. I didn't correct him. I understood now that the door wasn't just a door to him. It was a boundary. A place where things changed. A place where he had kept watch when I didn't know I needed it. People who heard the story later liked to call him a hero. They liked neat conclusions and clear roles. I never corrected them, but I never agreed either. He didn't save me in the way stories like to be told. He didn't pull me from a fire or drag me to safety. He stayed. He noticed. He refused to leave when leaving would have been easier, and I think that's what stayed with me the most. As the winter loosened its grip and the snow finally began to melt, I spent more time on the porch, sitting quietly, the two of us side by side. Cars passed. Birds returned. The world picked up its pace again. He watched it all without interest, his attention always returning to me. I don't know where he came from. I don't know how he decided that my door was the right one. I stopped wondering about those things. Some answers don't add anything once you've lived with the truth long enough. He never left that door again, and I never ignored him again.